In case it needed to be said, this video does contain spoilers for Baldur's Gate 3. Primarily Act 2 spoilers, so just be warned. Ketheric Thorm. The arguably most sympathetic of the main three chosen, and also antagonists of Baldur's Gate 3. Out of the Chosen of the Dead 3, Ketheric does have the best introduction, the most fleshed out story that informs his motivations, and the most well-integrated influence on the player and the story at large. He's easily the most impressive antagonist of the game, aside from the Absolute itself. But just like every other character in Baldur's Gate 3, Ketheric has more going on than just being a force for the player to take down. He's got depth and a lot of things to explore if you're willing. Ketheric is the end boss for Act 2 pretty much, making his fight and the lead up to it the most impressive out of the three main chosen. Act 2 as a whole, honestly, is a lot more solid and tied together than the rest of the game, and Ketheric, I do believe, is the main ingredient to that. With Act 1, you had a few main things going on, but it was mostly introductory to the world and your options and how to play the game, while Act 3 has the behemoth task of tying up all the loose ends and introducing more side quests to tie up for some reason. Act 2 is really able to focus on a through line, and because of that, we get to spend a lot of time getting to know the roles that Ketheric has played throughout history, and how his past has led him to where he is now, for better or worse. When you first see Ketheric Thorm, he is an imposing leader deciding the fates of Minthara and the goblins that have made it from the goblin camp to Moonrise. However, his patience is thin. Faith without action is no longer going to cut it.
Faith without action is anemic, sickly, in a word, useless.
Out of a desperate attempt to save herself, one of the goblins throws an axe at Ketheric, finding a home deep in his chest. And this is where we see the nature of the undying man. Ketheric is unbothered, more annoyed at the disrespect and the lack of loyalty. He gives the goblin another chance to strike him down, a flex on how untouchable he really is. It's an introduction that leaves the player wondering how on earth are we going to handle a villain that is seemingly invincible? Ketheric is everything a big bad antagonist should strive to be. Scary, cool, calm, collected, just the pinnacle of that is a serious guy, and he's very strong, and I don't think we can kill this man. And he has the strength to back all that up. His confidence is not unfounded. However, the suave villain is more human than we may initially realize. Long before the days of the Absolute, before the Shadow-Cursed lands, Ketheric was a man who was very devoted to his family and his goddess, Selûne. Ketheric loved his wife Melodia and their daughter. Things seemed to be going well for the Thorms and Brethwin. Ketheric had social power as the governor, and he seemed to be pretty well liked. Ketheric was also a doting father and a seemingly great guy on account of Isobel, who is his daughter. Ketheric and his family worshipped Selûne, and he was so devoted that he actually commissioned the construction of Moonrise Towers, initially as a grand bastion to Selûne's honor. However, misfortune would fall on the family when Melodia died. We don't really know how she died, but it was likely due to an illness or some kind of slow and predictable death. She left a parting letter explaining how she felt her time was near and how she didn't want to go, but she took comfort in knowing that her family would be reunited in the afterlife under the Moon Maiden's embrace. She also shares that their daughter had the light of Selûne shining brightly in her, and left Ketheric with a mission to help raise their child on Selûne's path. Things went on, Ketheric living as the single girl dad. However, raising a child is not easy, especially when said child grows up and falls in love with an Aasimar, the daughter of the god you worship. I know a lot of people like to joke that Ketheric hated Dame Aelin and his daughter dating because he was homophobic, and I do think that's funny, especially when paired with him being disgruntled about Dirge Tash. And if you want to read it that way, that is fine. But there's also the idea that Ketheric is having a hard time letting his little girl go, and he doesn't want to see her get hurt dating an immortal. Or maybe he was unsure of the power dynamics of the budding relationship, worried that his daughter was being taken advantage of. He didn't know that Dame Aelin practically worships the ground that Isobel walks on. As far as I could discern, we do not get an in-depth explanation for what exactly Ketheric's issue was. There could be a multitude of reasons, but given that we see he cares deeply for his daughter, I am more inclined to think his issue was more in her safety and not wanting to let her go and have her be a grown adult. More so than homophobia. We also just get a more interesting and sympathetic villain that way. With his relationship with his daughter going through a bit of a strain, it hit extra hard when she died, leaving Ketheric a man without a family and a mountain of grief. It's not stated in the full release of the game how Ketheric's daughter died, but in early access, we can learn that Halsin was the one who killed Isobel by accident after a fight broke out. This is cut content though, and there's not much else left in the game that points to this being the case, so I'm not really sure how much weight should be put on this, but as things stand, it's the only cause of death we have to go with. Either way though, Ketheric lost his daughter way too soon, and this broke him. First his wife, then his darling daughter. Ketheric became stricken with grief and turned away from his faith in Saloon. It's stated in a Mason's journal that Ketheric's faith must have died with his daughter. In Ketheric's journal, he writes about his struggles with grief and feeling like he lost Saluna's touch in his life. So overwhelmed by what he's lost, Ketheric ends up turning to Shar, the Lady of Loss, for comfort. He feels that he won't survive the grief of losing his daughter, especially after having lost his wife. But if he forgot, then maybe he could push through. He considers Shar's presence in his life a blessing now, granting him the ability to sacrifice his memories and giving him nothingness in return. Honestly, depression can feel like an empty nothingness, much like how Shadowheart and other characters in the game describe what Shar worship brings you. And in Ketheric's story, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to call his Shar era a metaphor for depression, especially considering we know the reason he turned to Shar was him trying to cope with grief. Most people struggle with depression when struggling with grief. Ketheric, fueled by grief and yearning for a way to cope, turns to Shar and becomes like a warrior for her, corrupting Moonrise Towers and forcing out Saloon, basically. I know that Shar hates Saloon, but I think Ketheric felt abandoned by the Moon Maiden after the death of his daughter. It stands to reason that he'd feel some personal spite to drive out all Saloonite worshippers and all, evidence of Saloon, eradicating any memory of the goddess who left him to his grief in his time of need. Ketheric fought hard for Shar, maybe in hopes that it'd actually help him in his struggles with grief and depression. However, we learn in his journal that no matter what he did, he couldn't forget. He couldn't get over it. He could not live with how things turned out. Bringing an end to Ketheric was such a huge deal initially. We know that the Harpers fought hard against him, and we see evidence of Hellbeasts being brought forth to fight against Ketheric in the Grimforge. And in the House of Hope, you can even meet the Mason who built Moonrise Towers. He shares how he made a deal with Raphael to bring an end to Ketheric in hopes of saving his home. We know that Halsin and the Emerald Grove helped the Harpers fight against Ketheric. It was a huge thing. And we know that Ketheric was ultimately killed. But just before his death, he brought upon the Shadow Curse, poisoning the land. His death may have brought an end to his reign, but definitely not his terror. As the player makes their way into the Shadow-Cursed lands, we're greeted with the fruits of Ketheric's effort as the shadows close in on us, threatening to take over. If you went through the Grimforge, taking the elevator from the Underdark to the Shadows, you're going to meet the Harpers first and find your way to Last Light Inn before making your way to Moonrise. At Last Light, we meet Isobel. If it's your first time playing the game, you won't know until later, but Isobel is Ketheric's daughter. This fact seems to be a secret that she's keeping, or a detail that she kind of ignores, effectively disowning the current version of Ketheric. She works to protect the people from the Shadow Curse and aids in efforts to cure the land. She is in direct opposition to her father, or the man that once was her father. She talks about him as if the Ketheric that raised her, the loving father, ceases to exist, and it's just some soulless echo of who he used to be that is the current Ketheric. So Isobel has this strong, disconnect between, past Ketheric and current Ketheric and all that. And it probably helps her, deal with the fact that her father turned into this monster. Isobel's introduction, however, is interrupted by Marcus, a true soul parading as a harper. He's been sent to retrieve Isobel, and it's of utmost importance that he takes her back to Moonrise alive. Ketheric has demanded it. Isobel does not understand why Ketheric would want her alive, or at least she plays dumb. She says she doesn't understand anything that man does. However, I think this wanting her alive shows that even though she's opposing him, he still cares about her. Ketheric wants her home, to be his daughter again. If you fail to keep Isobel from being kidnapped, she will end up being affected by a tadpole, becoming Ketheric's minion in his final fight. Her father's daughter again, but stripped of free will. This ties back to my point of Ketheric maybe having a hard time letting his daughter go, struggling to watch her grow up and leave the nest, essentially. It's not something that's explicitly stated in the game, but it's something that I have noticed a lot of parents struggle with when it comes to their firstborn or only child. I am a firstborn child. I have witnessed my parents come to terms with the fact that kids get older. I can imagine that this struggle would be even harder for a single parent who promised their dearly beloved to raise their child right, or a parent who's given his all to see his child be resurrected. Isobel was granted a second chance at life, and Ketheric sees that at his second chance of being the father he thinks she needs. So, in order to fulfill whatever he thinks a good father is gonna be, he's gonna tadpole her up so he can make sure that she follows him the right path, whatever the right path may be to Ketheric at that moment. Now that we've talked about where he came from and his daughter, it's time to talk about Ketheric the Undying. This man would have loved Undyne. No longer a warrior for Shar, Ketheric rules Moonrise Towers with Myrkul's blessing. Myrkul being the god of death and the first of the dead three we encounter in the game. 100 years or so after his death, Ketheric was resurrected by Myrkul to act as his general, gathering an army and working with the other two of the dead three. His payment for his work being Isobel's resurrection. Myrkul uses Ketheric's old grief and his desire to have a family again as leverage to get Ketheric to do his bidding. The key to Ketheric's everlasting mortality, though, isn't because of Myrkul. Instead, Ketheric has imprisoned the Night Song, Dame Aelin, and exploits her own immortality for himself, be it some kind of twisted poetic justice in his mind. I'm sure Ketheric blames Aelin for the downturn in his relationship with Isobel, Aelin being the outside force that changed things. I'm not saying it's right, but I do strongly feel that Ketheric feels that way. So Dame Aelin is stuck in the Shadowfell, bound by a soul cage, and feeding Ketheric's immortality. I do think this is something Ketheric does out of spite. Sure, him being immortal allows him to do his thing better. I think him taking Aelin and using her immortality was motivated by some twisted desire to get back at Aelin for messing with what he had left of his family. So here's Ketheric, using his immortality to better serve his god. Ketheric had even planned to betray the other two of the dead three, taking all the power and glory for himself and Myrkul. You could argue this is a move done for the greed of power on Ketheric's part, but I feel it's pretty clear that the Elder Brain is becoming more difficult to control with the way things currently are, and the thought is that one person wielding all three Netherstones would work better, and we see how deeply loyal Ketheric is to the god he worships. To a fault, almost. Despite the fact that he's hopped from god to god, during his time of worship, Ketheric gives his all, and I do see him wanting to betray Gortash and Orin is him wanting to do what he thinks is best for Myrkul, what he thinks would best repay Merkel for bringing his daughter back to life. We see how Ketheric places so much importance on Isobel being resurrected and how he owes Merkel everything because of that, and he literally gives himself to the gods. Ketheric is a man who has spent so much time grieving for his family and having his grief be used against him by the gods. We can see in game how Shar preys on people who are miserable, desperate, and undergoing a lot of turmoil, promising to take the pain away. We can see this in Shadowheart's story that part of Shar in worship is offering up memories to her, and if she turns her back on Shar and loses her parents, she shares that a part of her wishes she could turn to Shar and have Shar take away the pain of grief. And if Shadowheart becomes a Dark Justiciar and becomes the new Mother Superior of the Baldur's Gate Enclave, she'll mention post-game how after the devastation the city faced, there were a lot of desperate people that would be willing to turn to Shar. A lot of desperate people that she could reach out to and bring into the Sharan circle. Shar was able to take Ketheric's grief of losing his family and twist him into a loyal follower who would bring on the Shadow Curse. Merkel took a man who'd lost his daughter and turned Ketheric into a devoted follower by granting Isobel a second chance at life. Ketheric had undying loyalty for these gods because of the way each god seemingly helped him process and deal with his grief, despite how self-destructive these paths were for him. This is not to say that Ketheric is not responsible for his own actions, more so to say that his vulnerabilities and weaknesses were exploited by the gods. Behind the invulnerable mask is a very broken man who yearns for a family and a much happier time. One thing that supports this, and a commonality amongst the boss fights in Act 2, is your ability to talk your way through a fight, essentially getting the bosses to kill themselves. And Ketheric is no exception. The player can use information that they learn throughout the game, exploiting Ketheric's love for his wife and whatever shame he feels for how things turned out, talking him into redemption until he decides that he's not worth redeeming, effectively giving up and being overtaken by the avatar of Merkel, who then acts as if you killed Ketheric. I do genuinely believe that on some level, Ketheric hates who he's become. He hates how things played out, and on some level, he hates what he's done. It was ultimately his actions that drove Isobel away from him once they were granted a second chance. It was his actions that brought more pain and turmoil. And it's his actions that are keeping him from reuniting with Melodia on Saloon's path. In trying to handle the pain of grief, Ketheric dug the wounds even deeper and severed himself from the things he held dear. He feels remorse in his final moments, and maybe on some level he wishes he could correct it, wishes things could be different. This plays into the idea that Ketheric could have been a potential companion. It's something that Larian has gone on record to say was an idea they were toying with during the game development, but ultimately decided not to include. But that possibility shows that in Ketheric's character, there is a man who acknowledges his wrongs, and if it means making his wife happy or potentially reuniting with her in the afterlife or making things right with his daughter, then he would be willing to right those wrongs. Obviously, the game doesn't take this direction, but I do think there are still elements of what would make such a thing possible in his character. But that may just be me looking to make Ketheric a more sympathetic and set up a redemption arc for a man who just wants to be with his family again. A man who deserves to be more than just the god's pawn. That's my read on Ketheric. I know a lot of people talk a lot about Ketheric. I'm definitely not the first person to make a Ketheric analysis video, and I probably will not be the last. That man has a lot going on, and it's really interesting to look at and think about how his past has brought him to where he is, and how there's a very tangible this and this and this happened, so he's doing this and this in the game. You don't have that as strongly with Orin and Gortash. I do think it's still there, but definitely not as prominent in their stories. So that makes Ketheric a lot more fun to really just sink your teeth into. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you all in the next video. I can say the next Baldur's Gate video will be a Gortash one. We're gonna talk about Gort for more than just a few minutes in a Dirge Tash video. Anyway, bye. This little guy was running around being a crackhead while I was filming, and now that I'm done, he's all tuckered out. Look at him.